Hi everybody, and thank you again for watching another episode of Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at this 1200 watt bi-color light and its accessories. These guys have a projection mount for it, multiple dishes, and a 14-inch Fresnel. Now it might come as a surprise, but I think this is the best built unit that I've ever come across. So what's the surprise? It's made by Godox. All right, so let's start off with a quick overview of the light and cover off some pros and cons. Now, in terms of accessories like the Fresnel and the spotlight or projection attachment, they're in separate segments, so you can skip to those by having a look through the index. There'll be a timecode point, or on the time bar, it'll be chaptered. So if you're just interested in those things, you can skip straight to those. I'll cover the pros and cons for those separately, and also give you all of the spectrometer and technical data for those things at the same time in the same point. All right, so point of difference between this light and other 1200 watt lights. Number one is the build quality. This is easily the best built light that I've come across. Now, I'm not just saying that as a gear reviewer, I'm saying that as someone who's been a gaffer for 25 years. I can't think of any other light that I've come across that is more robust in terms of its strength of build quality than this unit is. Now, it's not the most perfect light in the world, but I'm just saying in terms of the build quality. If you're in a hostile environment, this thing will definitely take a beating. The locking system is unique. I have not come across any sort of locking system like this. So you've got this circle here and you've got like a double clutch pushing against the circle. It really locks nice and solid. You can remove the light from the stirrup as well if you want to break it down in terms of assembling it. Or if you're running this through another modifier like the projection mount, you can take the yoke off to reduce the weight a little bit. All right, so let's get into some of the cons. The first con is the weight. You know, superior build quality like this does come at a cost, and that cost is the weight. This thing is unbelievably heavy. One negative is fan noise. So you've got a very big fan under the bottom here, and you've got two fans on the back. I suggest that this would be borderline in its smart mode for being picked up on microphones. And if you're running it at full blast, I don't think you could get away with it. Pros, of course, the build quality. It's IP rated, so you can use it out in the rain. It's got CRMX built in. The DMX response is really, really good on the unit. Now, one big point that Godox like to make about this light is it has optical recognition. Now, this hasn't been programmed in yet. So here's the big sales pitch with the optical recognition. You can change over your modifiers and you'll get the same light value coming through in terms of your Kelvin, your white point, all that sort of stuff. Okay, here's the thing. That's a load of rubbish. That's not going to happen. And here's why. Because this is a bicolor light. It doesn't have green and magenta correction. It can only change its CCT. Now, CCT, when you change that, that tracks linear on a bicolor light. It doesn't track to the Planckian or the daylight curve. If you've got a modifier where you need to increase the Kelvin, you're also changing your green magenta value. So they are never going to get this system to work on a bicolor light to the point where you can change your modifiers and they all match perfectly. That is only going to be something that is capable of being done on a light with green magenta correction. Now, having said that this isn't going to work all that well in terms of getting your modifiers to line up, it does serve some very good purposes. Number one, it feeds power through to the projector or spotlight mount because that has cooling fans in it. But there is one bit of recognition where this really does work well, and I think other manufacturers, particularly going forward into brighter units, need to have this, and that is the cap. The cap has recognition on it. So let's go through a scenario here. Myself, or maybe one of my assistants, has wired everything up, it's turned on, and they don't realize that it's receiving a CRMX command telling it to run at 100% brightness. So that's actually what's happening now. It's receiving a command. Now, it's not even getting hot. Why? Because it hasn't turned on. It knew the cap was attached. Now, if we put another modifier on, there we go. Okay, so I think that is a fantastic safety feature. You can't turn this on with the cap attached and melt everything. But what if you want to run it with no modifier attached? Maybe you want a point source giving you crisp shadows, or maybe you simply want to light up something large like a 12 by 12 diffusion frame from in close. Well, you can go into the menu system and turn the optical recognition off, which I've just done now. But here's the catch. Let's power the system down, and when you power it back on, it automatically switches on the optical recognition. So the light is running, but it is not firing up because there's no accessory attached. Now, regardless of whether you have the optical recognition turned on or turned off, the light engine will not turn on if the cap is attached. The light also boasts a full color LCD screen, which is very intuitive and easy to use. You can adjust your brightness in 0.1% increments, and your Kelvin is tunable from 2800 all the way up to 6500 Kelvin in 100 Kelvin increments. To change your mode, you simply hit the mode button, and now we're in the effects mode, which is icon driven and very easy to work. Once you've selected your effect, press the set button, and now you're into the parameters. And once again, very intuitive to use. The menu system is also straightforward and very intuitive. On the one side of your control box, you have a DMX out, a DMX in, and a USB-A port. On the other side of the control box, you have your local area network connection, and you have your Nutrix in, but you don't have a Nutrix through. All right, let's go through how much it costs and what you get for your money. So this kit here sells for about $3,500 US and about 5,900 Australian dollars. Now for that price, it comes in a bag. Now it seems like a very well constructed bag, but it does have a lot of weight in it. So it'll be interesting to see how it holds up over time. All right, let's start pulling stuff out. So you get an instruction manual. You get a chart full of your DMX information. First thing on top is a stirrup. Okay, next thing in the kit I'll pull out is the light, which is quite heavy. Now the light doesn't have any controls on it. The controls are on the power supply. Next thing I'll pull out is the power supply. Now something to note, both the power supply and the head have an IP54 rating. Next thing is a 45-degree faceted dish. Now this dish has a strong external shell, a safety mounting point, and interestingly enough, it has a spring-loaded accessory slot, but it doesn't come with a gel holder, and also none of my existing wires fit into this. Also supplied in the kit are a couple of spare washers, a safety chain, an additional spare handle, the clamp for mounting a controller to your light stand, and a cable holder. You also get a head lead, and you also get a long Nutrix cable. Okay, let's see how this light performs. First off, with no modifier attached. And as you would expect, it has a very wide beam angle that could easily light up a large area or a large modifier. And something that's worth noting, there doesn't seem to be any color fraying towards the edge of the beam. The characteristics are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now, if you want the spectrometer information for the light with no modifier on, go to the technical data at the end of the episode. As you would expect, the shadows are nice and crisp. Now let's try it from a distance of about 5 meters away from a window. And as you expect from a point light source, very crisp shadows. You can even see the lace in the curtains. And this is regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now let's take a look with the supplied 45-degree reflector. And if you're comparing this to the reflectors on the Evoke series, it's definitely not as even. But it does output 40% more light level. The characteristics are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. But the shadows, they look like they're coming off a faceted dish. Now let's have a look at this combination through a window at a distance of about 5 meters. Now I don't think it's as sharp as the 45-degree reflector with the Evoke, but I must admit I was surprised with the amount of texture that actually did appear from the curtains. Now let's take a look at the spectrometer readings. With the supplied reflector and set to 3200 Kelvin, I got 3306 with an SSI of 84. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 was below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0008. So that would make the light at this point imperceivably magenta to roughly the equivalent of 1/3 of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5460 with an SSI score of 74. The TN30 colour render results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0011. And if your camera is working to the daylight curve, the light would be ever so slightly magenta to somewhere around the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Alright, so let's take a look at the optional 15-degree reflector, and it comes in this massive bag. So that is sort of one of the themes with this light. Everything is big, so that could be a bit of a storage issue as a negative. Alright, now in terms of the build quality, unlike other reflectors I've come across, this has a really solid shell. So if you drop this, it's not going to dent the reflector on the inside. So that is definitely a plus. I have found that to be a problem with other lights. So look, fantastic output, fantastic build quality, but in terms of storage, this unit is big. Now, as you would expect with a 15-degree dish, it of course does have a hotspot with a fair amount of drop off around it. But take a look at the lux readings. 88,600 lux at 5,600 Kelvin at a distance of 3 meters. Now I usually take my f-stop readings at 400 ISO, but because the numbers were ridiculous in this case, I've taken them at 100 ISO. There really is no point at having a look at shadows within 3 meters of a spot dish because the light's going to wrap around, but if I don't, people will ask why. Now let's try this combination through a window at a distance of about 5 meters. As you can see, the texture has disappeared from the shadows, but the payoff is we get a load of light level. Now let's take a look at the spectrometer readings. With the 15-degree reflector attached and set to 3200 Kelvin, I got 3266 with an SSI of 84. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0017, which would make the light at this point magenta to about 3/4 the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. With a 15-degree reflector and the light set to 5600 Kelvin, I got 5369 with an SSI score of 74. The TN30 colour render results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0011. So if your camera is working to the Planckian curve, that would make the light almost imperceivably green to somewhere around 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. And if you're working to the daylight curve, the light would be ever so slightly magenta to somewhere around the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. All right, so let's talk about the Fresnel now. So this Fresnel attachment sells for about $900 US, about 1,400 to 1,500 Australian dollars. Okay, so that is a bit of money. Obviously, this thing is heavy. The build quality is superb. This comes in at 30 kilograms with the light attached to the Fresnel and the barn doors. Now, just something to note, the barn doors are not sold with the Fresnel. They're an optional extra, and I can't seem to find a price online for those at the moment. Now, this sports a 14-inch glass Fresnel. Now, other features I like about this, it has an accessory slot which will fit a standard old school 14-inch wires. Now, I'm not a religious person, but praise Jesus and hallelujah, I can't believe somebody has finally made a Fresnel for an LED with an accessory slot that can take our wires. I mean, that should have been standard practice a long time ago. All right, now let's go through how this thing floods spots. So you turn the, rotate the back here and it'll flood spots. So you've got a 45-degree flood. So that's not a huge amount for a Fresnel if you're an old school gaffer, and it spots down to 15 degrees. So the flood spot mechanism is quite easy to operate, and it's got enough tension in it that if you've got it pointing down, it's not going to trombone on you. It's not going to move by itself. Now, it comes standard with a lot of safety wires which are permanently mounted to eye bolts, and the tension on the barn doors is adjustable through wing nuts, but you're going to need a set of pliers to do this. Now, in terms of output, this really is a powerful combination. It is definitely, in terms of firepower, the leader in this class. So I would put this at about halfway between a 2.5K HMI Fresnel and a 4K HMI Fresnel. It really is that powerful. In terms of the evenness of the beam, very happy with it. I think if you're used to old school Fresnels, I think you would like the evenness of the beam on this. All right, let's get into the negatives. So the overwhelming negative, unfortunately, this sort of build quality does lead to a lot of weight. So this whole setup here, the barn doors, the Fresnel and the light, smack on 30 kilograms. Okay, so that is something you've got to consider. That's a lot of weight, not just in terms of moving it around, but in terms of your lighting stands. This at 30 kilograms is right on the limit of the majority of wind-up stands. Now let's get to my big overwhelming negative. This is a huge red flag for me. It's not the fact that this setup weighs 30 kilograms, it's the fact that it's 30 kilograms of weight that is not over the center of my light stand. As you can see, my light stand is here and all the weight is offset. Now, if this doesn't concern you all that much, imagine this. Imagine you're operating it in full spot. Now you've got a massive amount of weight. You've got this 14-inch glass Fresnel a long way away from the light stand column. So that is a bit of a red flag for me. You're definitely going to want to have, if you've got this up at height, you're definitely going to want to have a leg underneath the light, and your back two legs really heavily shot bagged. But the main concern for me is, like I said earlier, this is on the limit of a wind-up stand, of most wind-up stands at 30 kilograms. But that weight limit on that light stand is built around the assumption that your weight is going to be over the center of the stand and not offset. Now, this Fresnel only floods out to 45 degrees, which is pretty common for attachable Fresnels. It has a beautiful even beam with no obvious fringing, and it outputs about 40% more brightness than an Evoque with its Fresnel. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. If I have a criticism, it's that the barn doors don't cut the entire width of the beam. This is something I personally find frustrating. But it does have a beautiful spot. Now, while it is way brighter than its competitors in the LED market, it definitely doesn't have the sharpness of shadows. Now let's try this combination through a window at a distance of about 5 meters in full flood. Now the shadow qualities and textures, they're okay. They're not the best I've seen from a Fresnel, but I'd be more than happy with this. Now let's try this combination with just enough spot to light up the entire window. As you can see, some of the texture has disappeared from the shadows, but it's handy to know that you can get that extra light level by simply giving the barrel a twist. Now let's take a look at the spectrometer readings. With the Fresnel attached and set to 3200 Kelvin, I got 3340 with an SSI of 83. The TM30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0016, which would make the light magenta at this point to about 2/3 of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5626 with an SSI score of 74. The TM30 colour render results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0007. So if your camera's working to the Planckian curve, this would make the light imperceivably green. And if your camera's working to the daylight curve, the light would be ever so slightly magenta to somewhere around the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Okay, let's have a look at the projector mount, and as you can see, this is a beast. Now the Spotlight sells for about $1,500 US, which is somewhere around the 2,000 Australian dollar mark. You'd expect it to be built pretty good for that price, and it is. It is absolutely rock solid. Now that rock solidness does have one big negative. The light attached to the projection mount comes in at a bit under 35 kilograms. Now that's minus the control box, of course, so this is one very heavy unit. All right, now in terms of safety, let's spin it around. So the light is attached to the projection mount, of course, through its mount system, but you also have a secondary mount here going into the stirrup holder. So the light is definitely not going to fall off the back. On the front here, you have a safety chain connecting to the lens barrel. So if you have this thing pointing down and you forget to lock the lens barrel in, it is not going to fall out. So they've really thought about safety. In terms of operating this, you've got a very fine-tuned adjustable focus here, and then you can lock that into place with the knob down the bottom here. You've also got further up here, you've got a slot for your gobos, and I'm assuming for an iris as well, because it looks like a double slot. Now with the gobos, they are quite big, so you get a gobo holder and you get 6 gobos. Now these gobos are 15 centimeters in diameter, so I've never come across this size before. I'm not sure if it's a standard size, but of course that means you most likely are going to have to buy a new set of gobos if you go with this unit. Now of course the unit does have its blades for adjusting your beam angles, well not adjusting your beam angles, adjusting your cuts, but I do have a few issues with the blades. Number one is the barrel doesn't rotate. Bang, don't you hate that? Now, in terms of trying to get maximum rotation out of the blades, you can't cut the entire beam. Once you get past a certain angle, you start to see the bottom of the blades. Now, in terms of the last negative for these is the noise. So I'm just going to turn it on. There are 2 cooling fans in the projector mount. You've also got the cooling fan underneath here, and you've got the 2 fans on the back. So as you can see, there are a lot of cooling fans around. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So not ideal for a sound sensitive environment. Now the Spotlight kit comes in this massive bag, which is quite heavy. It has wheels at one end and a pull-out handle. You can get it in 36 degree kit, 26 degree and 19 degree kit. They've given me the 36 degree kit for the review, so I can't give you the stats on the others. Now to give you some idea of how fussy these guys are about build quality, even the lens caps are metal reinforced. All right, so let's take a quick look at the barrels, and these are super heavy. So you can see here you've got your teeth, so that's for your focusing, your fine focusing control. Now you've also got accessory slots on the front for gel holders, things like that. Now I don't think it comes with one. I'll have a look through the kit. Now here's the possible pro and con for these. So the inside is completely sealed airtight. Okay, so no dust can get inside it. Now that's the pro, no dust gets into your optics. But here's the big negative. If you live somewhere that's cold like Melbourne, when the light hits this from the light on the back, and heats up the glass, the inside can fog. And this is the result. You can get a lot of haloing around the beam. Now, if you try to do blade cuts, they're very fogged. And your gobo projections, well, they're all haloed as well. Now, this is about 8 to 10 minutes later, and all that condensation inside the lens is gone, and I've now got crisp optics again. As you can see, the blade cuts are now nice and dark. But here's my criticism. If you're trying to do a steep blade cut because you can't rotate the barrel, you cannot get a blade cut across the entire diameter of the beam. With square patterns, you can notice some concaving, and it is not possible to get an even projection from edge to edge. The same applies with random patterns. The projection is not evenly focused across the beam, but you do have a massive amount of focusing and defocusing, regardless of the CCT you dial in. Now here I've set up a very thin slash from about 3 meters away, and I'm going to throw the light in and out of focus to see if the emitters come into play. And regardless of the CCT I dial in, they do not. Alright, let's take a look at the spectrometer data with the light running through the projection mount. Set to 3200 Kelvin, I got 3201 with an SSI of 86. The TM30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0010, which would make the light at this point imperceivably green to less than the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. When I set the light to 5600 Kelvin, I got 5101 with an SSI score of 74. The TM30 colour render results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0033. So if you're working to the Planckian curve, this would have a green hue to a little bit more than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. However, if you're working to the daylight curve, this is almost smack on, but it is a fair way off 5600 Kelvin. Now set to 5600 Kelvin through the projector, it had quite a low CCT there. So this light does have pins for optical identification, which hasn't been programmed yet. Now, when they do program that, it'll probably do some modifications and those readings won't be correct. But here's the thing, this is a bicolor light that doesn't have any green magenta correction. So all it can do for adjustment is change the Kelvin. Now, when you change the Kelvin on a bicolor light, that also affects your green and magenta point. So that is something to note. So what I've decided to do for some additional readings as well is I've dialed in, 6,300 Kelvin, because I found that that got the light through the projector mount to 5,600 Kelvin, or very close to 5,600 Kelvin. But in doing so, in changing the green magenta point, because a bicolor light tracks linear, it doesn't track to the Planckian or daylight curve, that affects the output values. Let's take a look. When I dialed in 6,300 Kelvin, I got 5,593 with an SSI score of 74. The TM30 colour render results were 93% colour accuracy with an average 99% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 and R12 are both down. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0055. So if you're working to the Planckian curve, this is noticeably green. by more than the equivalent of a 1/4 correction gel. And if you work into the daylight curve, the light still has a green hue to roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Okay, so let's start talking about the DMX. Now, with this unit is supplied a lot of DMX information. They even have formulas here, so if you have to set up your own profile, you can figure out how to do it. Now, as soon as this thing receives a DMX command, whether that's via hardwired DMX, CRMX, or over Ethernet, it automatically switches over to an on-screen DMX menu so you can see what your DMX settings are. It also has a CRMX status light. Now it's got a useful selection of profiles, including 8 and 16-bit profiles. It has an ultimate mode in 8 and 16-bit, so you can run things like your special effects. You can select what happens when you lose a signal. In terms of the CRMX, you can set this to be a receiver and a transmitter. And if you're running hardwired and this light is the last one in line, you can even turn on an internal terminator. Okay, so let's start off the DMX testing of the Godox running off a 2-channel bi-color 8-bit profile. I can't find any smoothing options in the menu, and it is running off a linear dimmer. To give you something to compare it to, I have an Evoke 1200B running off an 8-bit bi-color profile. Its smoothing is turned on and its dimmer is set to linear. Both lights are receiving their commands off their internal CRMX receivers, and they are both receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant on-off. Now let's do some half-second cues. Now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's take a look at some CCT changeovers between 5600 and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. Now let's have a look at some half-second changeovers. Now let's have a look at some 1-second changeovers. Now for some 2.5-second changeovers. Now for some 5-second changeovers. Now I'm going to do some random inputs just to see how the smoothing goes. Let's start going through all the data I've collected now, starting off with the AC power draw. The maximum power draw recorded over several days of testing was 1418 watt. At 3200 Kelvin, it is typically pulling 1404 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin, it is typically pulling 1386 watt. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics. According to my frequency meter, this is running pulse width modulation at 15,478 Hz. Despite this being a relatively low frequency, I cannot detect any flicker at all, even with a shutter speed above 1/17,000th of a second. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 50%, 10% and 5%. As you can see, the CCT is very consistent. The color render score does drop slightly from 100%, and there's very little shift in the white point until you get really low in the dimmer. Now let's take a look at the characteristics at 5600 Kelvin. Again, the CCT is very consistent. The color render does slightly drop as you're dimming, but there is a bit of deviation in the white point to roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's have a look at the average CCT accuracies. Between 2800 and 4000 Kelvin, it was typically off the target value by plus 83 Kelvin. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, it was accurate to plus or minus 27 Kelvin on average. Between 5100 to 6000 Kelvin, it was typically out by minus 63 Kelvin. And from 6100 Kelvin upwards, it was typically out by minus 159 Kelvin. Now let's have a look at the TN30 color render scores. Between 2800 Kelvin to 3100 Kelvin, it comes in with its high score of 96. From 3200 to 3700 Kelvin, it comes in with a score of 95. From 3800 to 5800 Kelvin, it comes in with a score of 94, and from 5900 Kelvin onwards, it has its lowest score of 93. Okay, let's take a more detailed look at some of our kelvins, starting off with the lowest CCT that we can dial in, and all of these readings are taken with no modifiers attached. When I dialed in 2800 Kelvin, I got 2949. The TN30 color render results were 96% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0019, which will give the light at this point a green hue, but still under that of the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3299 with an SSI score of 84. The TN30 color render results came in with an average 95% color accuracy and an average 102% color saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0017, which will give the light at this point a magenta hue, but still under that of the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4425. The TN30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0024, which will make the light at this point magenta to roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel, which is actually quite good for a bicolor light at this point. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5525 with an SSI score of 74. The TN30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0004. So if your camera's working to the Planckian curve, this is almost perfect. And if you're working to the daylight curve, it'll be slightly magenta to a little bit over the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 6500, I got 6283. The TN30 color render results were 93% average color accuracy with an average 99% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 are below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0035, which is pretty much smack on the daylight curve. That's another episode of Gaffer and Gear done. Thank you very much for watching. So in summary, I think the big negative for a lot of people is going to be how heavy all of this stuff is. It is quite a heavy unit, and that is because of the build quality. Now, I've got to say, I think Godox have made the right decision. Despite the fact that this is not the light for me, because it is too heavy for my liking, I think it is the right call because the brand name Godox is not synonymous with build quality in the film and television industry. Now, if you have a look at this light, you cannot deny the build quality. It is in your face, front and center. So this light really is a statement from them that they can make a light that'll match any other light that you've got in terms of robustness. I also think it's a clever play as well because these guys are a little bit late to the 1200 market. Now, everybody I know that has not got Evokes in their kit has a simple logic behind it. They don't think the Evokes are robust enough to survive in a hostile environment. That is their only reason for not having them. This thing is robust. So I think despite the fact that it's heavy, and that's going to be a huge negative for a lot of people, it does give them a unique market share, that 1200 watt category with a superior, robust build.